Stephen, let's talk about the IPCC report just by nature and the importance of it. This establishes a baseline of evidence to move forward with. U.S. policy, international policy, this is bedrock, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, the major objective with the IPCC is to bring together the scientists who are producing the literature, both in the scientific realm in terms of atmospheric science and in terms of impacts and potential biophysical and economic effects of climate change, and then also in terms of mitigation technologies and how might they be used to address climate change. And to force them to synthesize essentially the research that's out there. It's such a broad set of researchers and research types that it becomes, it's a sort of a necessary activity to sort of help put together information and then present it in a digestible way that policymakers can then sort of interpret and understand and potentially use it as a means for making their decisions.
Given the breadth and depth of this report and the potential influence that it will have, is there an intimidation factor in terms of how far-reaching what you conclude will be?
Yeah, there's a combination of things. So there's one, it's an overwhelming and an impressive effort. There's so many authors involved for such an extended period of time, and there's always new information being generated along the way from the research community. So just simply trying to sort of stop and take stock of everything is a major accomplishment in itself. And at the same time, you're always left wanting because you, of course, can't give all the answers that policymakers are looking for. You can only provide a certain part of the information that's available, and that's based on what current science allows you to say. And so at the end, you're left with, in many ways, a research agenda to pursue going forward in terms of what we understand at that point in time. So.
Is step one proving or concluding that we as humans are indeed causing or accelerating climate change? Is that still an open question in your mind?
The last assessment report, which was completed in 2007, one of its significant findings was establishing the anthropogenic signal in the historic climate record. So there was a variety of exercises undertaken in the climate science community, looking at sort of what sort of trends have we seen in terms of climate change and atmospheric composition of carbon dioxide, and whether or not we can reproduce that information without the human contribution in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and just simply produce it with a natural contribution. And they definitively established that so we have essentially, we can't reproduce that information without the human component. So that we are contributing to sort of what we've seen so far in climate change. And that actually has changed the discussion quite a bit in terms of how do we go forward from here in terms of thinking about what are our potential futures in terms of climate change, and what kinds of technologies might be available as we go forward.
Your particular section is entitled Assessing Transformational Pathways. We hear the President, the administration regularly talk about transforming our nation into a clean energy economy. Are we talking about similar transformations here, changing the way we generate electricity, we use energy?
Yeah, and very much so. The transformational pathways really has two components. One is sort of a long-term perspective in sort of where we might want to go in terms of future climates. And that's driven in large part by risk perception. And what do we think in terms of potential threats for climate change on the biophysical side in terms of economic outcomes? And it's also by a whole variety of other considerations. So that's sort of one part of it, where might we go. And then in between that long-term objective and where we are today is this transformation process. And that's a transformation in terms of, potential transformation in terms of energy technologies, both in terms of generation as well as end use of technologies like energy efficiency kinds of measures, in transportation sector as well as the power sector, as well as in industry, and as well as in land use related activities. And then within that is also sort of the more detailed kinds of decisions, sort of like how do we think about sort of broad policies as well as thinking about more specific policies that are focused on certain activities in the economy.
Regarding the element of risk, are you assessing risks of making the wrong choice, or is it also assessing the risk of doing nothing as we go forward?
Yeah, well, there's a variety of different risks that are relevant when thinking about the climate change issue. There's the risks of potential threats associated with climate change. And that's actually covered in a different part of the report under the IPCC. And there's a whole group of scientists focused on the impacts of climate change. And they study the historic kinds of information and what we can see in the historic record in terms of changes in climate and changes in systems, biophysical systems in the economy. And then they also look forward and try to think about what might happen under different climate futures. And that's where the information regarding the potential risks of climate change. And at the same time, the climate modeling community is looking at sort of large-scale kinds of threats, like potential ice sheet melt or changes in ocean circulations, those kinds of things, because that's more in the geophysical realm of things, where you're modeling all the ocean systems and the atmospheric systems at the same time. So those are that's sort of the characterization. That's where the information regarding those kinds of threats comes from. And our understanding. And at the same time, there's risks associated with when technologies might be available. So as we're looking forward into the future and thinking about what might climate look like under different policy regimes, or with or without policy, or those kinds of things, the important consideration there is thinking about what kinds of technologies might we be looking at as we move forward in the future, and also what kinds of socioeconomic futures are we looking at in terms of economic growth, in terms of populations, in terms of consumers' preferences, those kinds of things.
Just two more questions, Stephen. First of all, the 2007 report, the previous report, was a landmark report. The Nobel Prize has been associated with it, with Dr. Pachauri and Vice President Gore as well. But there are also a few blemishes within the last year or so regarding that report. Does that change, in your mind, how the 2014 report will be received? Or does it change your direction going forward?
I think what it does is a couple things. One is that the awareness of climate change and the research associated with climate change has risen. And so we're seeing increased attention and scrutiny with respect to the information that's being produced. And I think that's appropriate. That's appropriate for any particular policy-related issue where it matters, right? This is another case. In terms of how the IPCC proceeds going forward in the future, to some degree, maybe there will be some additional level of due diligence, both within the IPCC as well as review in terms of its interaction with external reviewers of the report, as well as governments, to ensure that some of the issues, mistakes, so to speak, that arose in the past don't reoccur.
Now, you've been on the receiving end of this report. In 2007, you were with EPA, deeply involved in using the information from that 2007 report. How will this be received by the U.S. delegation, by whatever administration is in power at that point? How influential can this report be within U.S. circles?
Yeah, so one of the values of the IPCC assessment reports is that the governments, commissioned the report. So they're essentially have this particular need for synthesized information, for a summary of the current state of knowledge and the current gaps in knowledge. And so that's, in itself, makes it a valuable product because the governments are very interested in what the report's going to produce. The other particular element that makes the report extremely valuable is that the governments, at the end of the day, actually approve the report and approve the summary reports that come from the large reports, the background documents, essentially. And that's an important statement because the governments, as a group, essentially approve the report. So all the governments are saying that what they see in those reports they agree with, essentially, in terms of understanding. And that makes a statement about and provides sort of a foundation for where negotiations start from, because they now have sort of a common understanding or a common recognition of understanding going forward. And so that's valuable, especially as science marches forward, and so doing another report and bringing everybody up to date in information is crucial.